The clones of the Republic used a wide range of blasters, but what were they all? Well, in today's video, I will break down every single blaster traditionally used by the clones of the Republic, both in Legends and in canon.
For the Republic!
The clones of the Republic had many different blasters they could use, from primary blasters that were used more often, to secondary pistol blasters, all the way into some heavy blasters that made clones basically walking gun emplacements. However, let's take a look at the first category, the primary blasters. Now, the primary blasters used by the clones were probably the blasters used the most. Here, I'm using a primary blaster to mean a blaster used alongside another weapon, but was carried most of the time. Think a primary weapon in a video game. And this is the largest category of blasters. Almost half of the blasters used in the primary category all came from the DC-15 line. These blasters were what we see 95% of the time when we see clones on screen. And there's actually a total of 5 blasters in the DC-15 line, but only 4 of them are classified as dedicated primary blasters for a regular trooper. So let's get right into them. The first variant was the standard DC-15. This is the longer barreled version that you would see troopers carrying into combat. It was produced by Blastech Industries, which is what every single blaster in the DC family was manufactured by. It was able to fire between 300 and 500 bolts depending on the power level before it needed to reload, and it had a maximum range of up to 10 kilometers. That is, under the right circumstances, of course. And this was the clone's go-to choice for longer range. The next blaster in the DC-15 line is the DC-15A. This was the shorter version of the DC-15 that we would see. The DC-15A was more suited for close range combat and could have an ascension cable attachment for helping to scale walls attached to the weapon. Now, this blaster had a capacity of 500 bolts and was right there up there with the DC-15 as the most used blaster by the clones. The next DC-15 variant was the DC-15LE. This weapon was known as more of the heavy version of the DC-15 that could fire at longer ranges and could be outfitted with stronger blaster bolts like explosive fire bolts. Unfortunately, this variant of the DC-15 has very little information on it, but we do know that it's all serviced past the Clone Wars being used by the Purge troopers. Now, the final DC-15 variant that is a primary weapon was the DC-15X, or the Clone Sniper Blaster. Now, in canon, once again, there's very limited information about the DC-15X, but we do know that it was made to cause more damage at greater ranges, all at the cost of bolt capacity, and of course, it was equipped with a longer range scope as well. However, let's take a look at some of the other primary blasters used by the clones. The next weapon was the DP-23, and this was the only blaster shotgun that we know the clone army would use. Now, it was known for its bolts that could spread out and pierce through enemy defenses. And again, like many of the other blasters, this weapon has very limited information in canon. However, we do know that it was the clones' one and only choice if they wanted a blaster shotgun in combat. Our next blaster is purely a Legends blaster, and it was known as the DC-19, or the Stealth Carbine. Now, this weapon was technically classified as part of the DC-15 line, but it was known for its suppressor that made its bolts almost completely silent, and its stealth mode, which allowed for the blaster bolts to be invisible to the naked eye. Now, there was one trade-off to these advantages, and that was that it did not have a stun mode to be switched to. Additionally, this blaster was almost exclusively used by the clone Shadow Troopers. Moving on to our final 3 blasters, though, all 3 of these were extremely versatile. And the first one on that list would be the 7.73 Fire Puncher Sniper Rifle. Now, this is the first blaster we're going to talk about that wasn't made by Blastech Industry, but rather by Mersun Munitions Incorporated. Now, this blaster, like I said, was one of the most versatile in the Republic and was the most versatile sniper that the Republic had. At its base, it fired a very powerful bolt, but it was a great blaster because it was highly customizable, being able to fire specific bolt types like bolts that could reflect off surfaces, as well as being able to shoot grappling hooks, homing beacons, tripwires, electro darts, and more. It made this sniper more than just a sniper because of its versatility. Now, the next blaster we're going to talk about is one of my personal favorites, and that is the DC-17M Interchangeable Weapon System, or simply known as the DC-17M. And this was the standard issue blaster of the Clone Commandos. Now, in canon, we only know the basics of this weapon, but that's enough, because it could fire as a blaster rifle, an anti-armor grenade launcher, or as a sniper blaster. Now, in Legends, we do get a bit more in-depth information, like the blaster rifle mode could fire 60 bolts before needing to reload, the anti-armor grenade launcher had a blast radius of 4 meters and had to be reloaded after every shot, and the sniper could fire 5 bolts before reloading. Nonetheless, the DC-17M was another extremely versatile weapon in the Galactic Armory, and like I said, one of my favorites. And the final blaster we're going to talk about in the primary category is the WESTAR M5, which was almost exclusively used by the ARC Troopers of Legends. Now this weapon was highly configurable with a semi-auto, automatic, and burst fire mode, as well as a wide range of attachments from grenade launchers to larger scopes, which allowed it to be used in a range of situations. Now compared to the DC-15, it is said that this weapon aimed to improve in many aspects that the DC-15 failed, including making it easier to aim, having a better stock, and giving it larger bolt capacity. While this blaster was primarily used by the ARC Troopers and the Alpha ARC Troopers, it was also used by the Galactic Marines. But unfortunately, this is another weapon that only exists in Legends. However, now that we've covered the main primary weapons of the clones, let's move into their secondary blasters. Now, a secondary blaster in this case was a blaster that was carried alongside a primary blaster that I mentioned above. And this is a very short category with only 2 blasters in it, but they were 2 very important blasters. The first blaster on this list was the DC-17, which was the Republic's one and only blaster pistol for regular clone troopers. It was lightweight, small, it had a 50-round bolt capacity, and some clones actually exclusively carried these into battle as dual-wielded. The DC-17 was arguably the most widely used blaster in the Republic military just because of how many clones carried it. However, I do want to take a second to talk about another blaster pistol that shares the same name. This DC-17 model that you see on screen now was the DC-17 model used by Alpha ARC Trooper Fordo in the 2003 Clone Wars, and its existence in current continuity is a bit confusing. See, originally this was the DC-17, because when Revenge of the Sith came out, we only knew what the back half of the DC-17 looked like. However, when the 2008 Clone Wars came out, it replaced them with a different look, the current one that we see. Now, some sources will call the older 2003 DC-17 a modified version of the current canon one called a commando pistol. However, the sources on this are a bit confusing. Regardless, the 2003 DC-17's existence is 100% Legends, but it is still called the DC-17 and is one really cool blaster. Now, the other secondary blaster used by the Republic was the DC-15S, and this was the last member of the DC-15 family. Now, this was the blaster pistol exclusively carried by the Clone Commandos. Now, in current canon, this blaster doesn't really exist. It exists because of some toys, but isn't named. However, in Legends, this was the reliable sidearm that was carried by the Clone Commandos, as I said. It could fire 250 bolts before reloading, and could operate at ideal ranges of 30 meters, but be used all the way up to 120 meters. Additionally, one cool aspect of it is its bolts could be constantly recharged by an energy cell. However, now we move into the final category of blasters used by the clone troopers, the heavy blasters. Now, I'm classifying heavy blasters in this case as blasters that clones carried that were extremely large and had a high firepower. Additionally, they were usually never carried with any other weapons. And this list only has 2 canon weapons as well as a number of Legends weapons. But let's take a look at our first blaster in this category. The first heavy weapon we will talk about is the only heavy blaster that was carried solely by one clone trooper in canon, and that is the Z6 rotary blaster cannon. Now, this weapon was a large blaster that had rotating barrels, often called a chain gun, and was produced by Mersun and Blastech. Its creation aimed to fix 2 problems that limited blaster fire rate: recharge time and overheating, and this is why the rotating barrels came into play. Now, as I mentioned before, this blaster is classified as a chain gun. Now, this leads to some sources calling this blaster from the original Battlefront a shoulder-mounted Z6, while other sources just call this a chain gun. Nonetheless, this blaster, the shoulder-mounted one, only exists in Legends, but I did want to bring it up for the sake of providing you all with as much information as I could. Now, the other heavy blaster that existed in canon had to be carried by 2 clones, and it was also produced by Mersun and Blastech, and that was the EWHB heavy repeating blaster cannon. With ranges from 200 meters to 500 meters, this weapon was extremely powerful and actually had to be set up to be used. This is why it usually needed a 2 to 3 man crew to be operated and was often considered a turret. Now, this model, the EWHB, was introduced later on in the Clone Wars. There was an earlier model used in the early Clone Wars, but we aren't sure the exact name of it. However, let's get into our final blaster on this list. Our final weapon is one of the most powerful, but only exists in Legends. That is the Reciprocating Quad Blaster Cannon, which was produced again by Mersun and is often referred to as a scaled-down anti-starfighter emplacements that clones could carry on their chest. Now, technically, this blaster is in canon, but only because of Star Wars Commander, the mobile game, so it's often not counted as official canon by some sources, but other sources like Wikipedia do claim it's canon. Now, this is the full extent of traditional blasters used by the clone army of the Republic, but there were a wide range of other weapons used by the clones. This includes rocket launchers like the RPS-6, which was made by Mersun and Steiner Fleet Systems, or the PLX-1, which in Legends was created by Mersun, the clone mortar, the clone flamethrower, also known as the X-42 heavy flame projector, or even grenade launchers, both dedicated and underbarrel grenade launchers and EMP launchers, and even more weapons used by the clones. But all of these weapons are not blaster based and therefore are not included in the detailed list I've given in this video. Nonetheless, we have now looked at every single blaster used traditionally by the clone army. I hope you all enjoyed, and if you did, make sure to like and subscribe for more content like this.